creation, right? We're talking about creating things. Design is creating things. I talked last week about, or on Tuesday, about the manufacturing process and watching things being made. And we talk about creativity as the ability to imagine what can be made. But design is a creative act. And it used to be that in the 16th and 15th and 14th centuries, we believed that all creative acts were an act of God. We had an awareness, our consciousness was such that what we were doing was simply channeling what God was telling us to do, or a God. And there were different cultures with different religions and different ways of looking at this. But there was broadly an understanding that the creative act was actually something that could only be done by some higher being. And we were simply the hands of God, if you like. And what that did is it sort of got us off the hook. It removed us from responsibility and engagement with the creative process. And we'll see what that did to us in terms of innovation and in terms of how we went about doing that as we go through this discussion. So the consciousness, if you like, that was around at the time that this painting was done was a God consciousness. It was a consciousness of a higher being responsible for things, that the forces of nature, that we live by the forces of nature, and that the forces of nature are created by a power that's out of our control, that's greater than us. And that to create well, you have to appease the gods. You have to do things that satisfy the gods. And that is, if you like, the design ethic that you apply to everything that you make, satisfying the gods. But we, as a global culture, we turned to science right around the time that that painting was done. We turned to the idea that we can know the world in its entirety. We can study the world and we can know it. And if you like, God consciousness or nature consciousness was replaced by a scientific consciousness that says that we live by the forces of nature, and that the forces of nature are created by a power that is greater than us. And we need that if we study them, the forces of nature are evident and predictable. And if we study them, we can harness them and control them for our own benefit. And that really is the awareness that we had around creativity in the entire period that we've been living by science, where science has been more of a factor in our lives. And we've started to understand that if you think about the very basis for engineering is often thought to be science, not art, not the qualitative aspects of the human experience. And so we come to what I call design consciousness, which is something that really is only, I'd say, still emerging. We're starting to grapple with this idea that we are in fact living in a world that is entirely made up of artifacts that we create. They're not objects of natural evolution, but they're artifacts of our own creation, all right? And we are able to create any artifact that we want or that we can imagine. You saw in a lot of the definitions that you all gave, those were all reflections of if you like, what I would call a design consciousness that's very current, that everything's an artifact, everything is designed, and we can design it. We don't always design it well, but we do design it. And so our goal here is to learn how to design everything well, not just the fancy things, not just the things that are made for special purposes, but everything, the things that make our lives, all right? And so we're going to have a little history now. Very often when people talk about the history of design, they'll start telling you about different styles and how one style follows another style, and things go from one famous designer to another famous designer. I'm not very interested in that, and I'm not going to be talking about that at all, because what I'm going to be talking about that is the processes and the practices of design, how they have evolved as we've evolved this new design consciousness that we work with now, this understanding that everything is an artifact. We design them whether we know it or not, or pay attention to it or not, and we better pay attention to it. Otherwise, we're going to end up with the kinds of conditions that we were just noting are outside right now. All right, so that really is the staging. That's where we're going to be going for the next half an hour, 40 minutes or so. What I just want to say, we're going to take a pause, a little stretch break. Everyone can stand up and get some blood flowing. But what I would please invite you to, and we're having very little discussion so far, please have questions, have comments, thoughts about it. It helps break things up a little bit, and it gets you into the conversation so that you can really grapple with this material on your own terms. All right, so let's just take about a minute or two break.
All right, Professor, can I ask you a question?
Yes.
So you were talking about how like the artifacts that are of our own creation are like separate from natural design, which is very much so a design. Sort of to give an example of where I am thinking of that crossroads, and like I see this on the screen right now, this stone tool that is being called an artifact. And of course, like there are animals which use tools. But to take that example, like where is that limit between like the natural design and the artifacts of our own creation that are separate from that? Because ultimately, pretty much everything we have made is from a natural design. All the stuff we need comes from resources and are made in that certain way.
Well, Carter, that's a great question, and that really is at the center of this. Let me just get a stretch, because I'm going to go right back to that question just after everyone's gotten back, because I think that's a very important question.